In 2012, the world was surprised to learn that a cruise ship named Costa Concordia had sunk off the coast of Italy. It was the first sinking of a major cruise ship since at least the Oceanos in 1991, and it's debatable whether or not Oceanos was a major cruise ship at the time. In any case, the sinking of large passenger ships was practically unheard of in 2012, and Costa Concordia was the first sinking of a cruise ship in the sense that most people today think of cruise ships. So naturally, the tsunami of Titanic comparisons hit without delay.
Much bigger than the Titanic.
Infamous cruise ship disasters since the Titanic.
I heard one report it was 3 times as big as the Titanic.
The fact that you could have seen these comparisons coming from 50 miles away does not make them any less ridiculous. Listening to a mainstream news outlet discuss a topic you're familiar with is always revealing of the quality of news you're receiving and makes me at least wonder what else they're getting wrong on a daily basis. Before I explain why it is ridiculous to compare Costa Concordia to Titanic, let me briefly explain what happened to Costa Concordia. Costa Concordia was on a 7-day cruise in the Mediterranean. The cruise started on January 11, 2012, from the port of Cagliari, from which it would sail to Palermo in Sicily, then Civitavecchia, north of Rome. From there, it would make way for Savona on the northern coast of Italy. But the ship would never reach its third port of call. The official course would have taken the ship between mainland Italy and the island of Giglio, which is approximately 10 miles offshore. But the captain, Francesco Schettino, deviated from this course to perform a sail-by of the island of Giglio, which would have given the passengers a unique nighttime view of the island. This is not where things went wrong. Deviations from planned courses are common, particularly for cruise ships as they avoid bad weather systems and optimize the itinerary for passengers. Costa Concordia had apparently done this very same maneuver in the past, and it could have been done safely. Captain Schettino was not on the bridge when the ship was nearing the coast of Giglio, and was instead attending a dinner in the main dining room with passengers. This too was not abnormal, as the secondary function of the captain is to serve as a figurehead of the cruise line and ambassador for the passengers. Like it or not, captains of passenger ships have always had to be good at socializing. On the bridge, the other officers were guiding the ship to the island. Captain Schettino returned to the bridge as the ship was nearing the island of Giglio. Due to an error in communicating the calculated turn to the officer at the helm, the ship made a wider turn, which brought Costa Concordia within a ship length of the island, much closer than was planned and considered to be safe. Once Captain Schettino realized the error and that the ship was far too close to shore, he ordered a 20-degree turn to starboard, but it was too late and the ship collided with a rock below the waterline at 21:45. The rock tore a nearly 200-foot gash in the hull, breaching 3 watertight compartments. The main power generators shut down immediately, and the ship lost propulsion. At that point, the ship only had the power supplied by its emergency generators, which kept the emergency lights on. Information was kept from passengers while Captain Schettino spoke with Costa Cruises' crisis center. Passengers congregated on the promenade deck and attempted to board lifeboats even though orders had not yet been given. It was not until 22:33, nearly an hour after the collision, that the order was given to abandon ship. An hour had been lost, and the ship was beginning to list to starboard. Captain Schettino boarded a lifeboat and made it to shore, where the Italian Coast Guard argued with him and tried to get him to return to his ship, where his crew was struggling to launch the lifeboats. But Schettino remained on shore. In the end, 32 passengers died in the sinking. Most of these people had been trapped in the lower decks as the ship took on water. Given the lack of leadership and the inability to use the portside lifeboats due to the severe list the ship was taking, more lives could have been lost had the ship been farther from shore, and in this regard, Costa Concordia was lucky. Now, let me explain why the sinking of Costa Concordia is unlike Titanic in almost every way. I won't go into the technical aspects of the two sinkings because the technical differences between the two are far too extensive to cover in this video. Instead, I will focus on the human element. Afterwards, I will explain why I think it matters. First, the obvious. Costa Concordia was dramatically larger than Titanic, about 2.5 times larger. Despite what the media would have you believe, this is not particularly noteworthy, since nearly every major cruise ship is larger than Titanic. But I digress. Since Costa Concordia was more than twice as large as Titanic, she was carrying approximately 4,250 passengers, compared with Titanic's approximate 2,200. Despite this, the sinking of Titanic in April 1912 resulted in the death of approximately 1,500 people, or about 68% of those on board. The sinking of Costa Concordia resulted in the death of 32 people, or 0.75% of those on board. And the passengers among these 32 were traveling for very different reasons from those aboard Titanic. They were on board for vacation, holiday, relaxation, whatever you want to call it, but they were there to have a good time. While the passengers aboard Titanic were crossing the Atlantic to start a new life, for business, to visit family, or to return from holiday in Europe. They were trying to get across the Atlantic, and the luxuries that the ship offered only made the voyage more pleasant, but it wasn't why they were there. This is not to diminish the lives lost aboard Costa Concordia. We all go on vacation, but my intention is to provide context and acknowledge that the people involved in these two events were different, and so the events themselves were different. Both events were caused by some form of negligence. But one of these incidents was caused by the wanton negligence of a single individual, while the other, the sinking of Titanic, was caused by the negligence of an entire industry and exacerbated by the negligence of society itself. Titanic went down in the North Atlantic in April, with no other ships in the immediate vicinity. Costa Concordia went down within swimming distance of shore, in the relatively warm waters of the Mediterranean. Granted, it was January, so the water would not have been ideal for leisurely swimming, but some survivors did swim ashore. Finally, there were enough lifeboats for all souls on board Costa Concordia, but Titanic, of course, had far too few lifeboats to save all her passengers and crew. Which leads me into one of the less obvious differences between these two disasters. The situation aboard Titanic was an inevitable tragedy from the moment the ship struck the iceberg. Had everything from that point forward gone perfectly, hundreds would have perished nonetheless. Most of the loss of life from the Costa Concordia incident could have been avoided even after the ship had struck rocks. But the crew's handling of the situation was far from ideal and plain criminal in some cases. The crew of Titanic, for the most part, did the best they could given the situation. Yes, some mistakes were made, but I shudder to think what would have happened if the crew of Costa Concordia were in charge aboard Titanic, never mind the fact that they wouldn't have known how to operate most of the equipment. Unlike most disasters at sea, Titanic and Costa Concordia actually both unfolded over hours rather than minutes. This is one similarity. If you've seen my video on why we remember Titanic, you know that I credit the slowness of the sinking for the mythical outcome of that sinking. And what I mean by that is that many of the dramatic and storied events which occurred aboard Titanic would not have had she sunk in, say, 20 minutes like her contemporary Lusitania. But the lack of diversity among those aboard Costa Concordia in terms of class and purpose of being on board meant that the tragic stories of individuals on board the ship were similar and driven by action rather than circumstance. This, of course, does not make the situation any less tragic, but it is another major difference from the sinking of Titanic. Today, we revere many of the people involved in the Titanic story, including the crew. Yes, there are people who still place blame squarely with Captain Edward Smith, and the merits of that argument can be debated. But putting him aside, the crew of Titanic acted with valor, and we remember them for this to this day. We might be embarrassed as a society to admit that we ever thought it was a good idea to send ships to sea without enough lifeboats, but we take pride in the actions of our forebearers in the face of tragedy and danger. The preparation and launching of the lifeboats was no small task on board an ocean liner in 1912, and we know that the crew executed this task, even with insufficient training and knowledge of the new ship, with great professionalism and honor. The crew proceeded to load the lifeboats with uncooperative passengers at first, and then panicking crowds of desperate people. Many of these men would not get into a lifeboat themselves. Below, the ship's engineers worked to keep the lights on until the very end, knowing that they themselves had little hope of survival, but that their efforts could save countless lives. Without diminishing the efforts of the entire crew of Costa Concordia, the actions of the officers cannot be equated to those of Titanic. The sinking of Titanic is a part of history, and for good reason. The number of deaths alone undoubtedly left its mark, invisible as it may be, on the course of history. Immigrants were the backbone of North America and the United States, and the growing continent lost hundreds that night. Among those on board could have been the next famous inventor or rags to riches story. Some of the rich and powerful people on the ship might have made a difference on the political scene or in industry. Many of those passengers would have had children who might still be alive today. Titanic reminded the world that its singular means of crossing oceans was not as safe as they might have hoped, and it forever changed an industry equivalent to the airline industry of the 21st century. It changed the way people viewed the world. Like Titanic, Costa Concordia did result in some regulatory changes, such as the requirement for all passengers to participate in a muster drill prior to or upon departure from port, rather than within 24 hours of departure, as was the case in the past. But even in this regard, Titanic's impact was greater, with the resulting changes to regulations and industry practices being much more sweeping. Costa Concordia was a senseless tragedy, and one that we should remember and learn from. But comparisons to Titanic are unwarranted and misguided at best, and opportunistic and harmful at worst. It is part of something that I call Titanicization. That is to say, the tendency to compare any disaster, particularly one that is spectacular or involving transportation, to the sinking of Titanic. Titanicization is a ubiquitous phenomenon in our society, and it almost always stems from either ignorance or sensationalism. After all, there are very few disasters that mirror Titanic in any real way. And in fact, any given disaster likely has a much more appropriate shipwreck counterpart than Titanic, given how many shipwrecks occurred throughout history. And to default to Titanic is to forget the countless other maritime tragedies of equal significance, and to take advantage of the victims of Titanic, who have been mythicized like characters in a fairy tale. Mainstream media outlets are perhaps the most guilty of Titanicization, which is part of a larger trend in the industry to resort to clickbait and yellow journalism in a misguided attempt to remain relevant and increase revenue. And these are the very institutions which should be held to a higher standard. They're having vast resources and talent at their disposal. It's hard to blame individuals for Titanicization when every aviation accident resulting in the loss of life is called the Titanic of the skies by supposedly credible media outlets. And that's all I have to say about that.